There is a very rare moment in some people's lives when something silent happens inside them, and nothing in the external world can fully explain what has changed. It is not a visible event. It is not an announced decision. It's not a dramatic breakup. In fact, to those who observe from the outside, almost nothing looks different. The person continues to live his routine, continues to talk to the same people, continues to walk the same streets. But inside it, something old has ended. Carl Jung has often described that there are moments in the psychological journey when the old identity simply ceases to exist. Not because someone has decided to change, but because the soul has already crossed a point where it is no longer possible to return. This is the moment when the loner begins to enter what many call the Sophia phase. It is not a stage of superiority. It is not a spiritual title. It is a quiet transformation that few can recognize, even in themselves. Because before they get here, almost everyone goes down the same invisible path. Years of trying to fit in, years of trying to be understood, years of trying to explain feelings that no one around seemed to really understand. The empath is sorry. The lonely observes too much, and for a long time this seems more like a curse than any kind of gift. But there is a point in the journey when something changes profoundly. The person stops fighting who they are. She stops seeking approval. She stops explaining her own essence. And when that happens, a new identity begins to emerge. An identity that no longer needs external validation to exist. Carl Jung said that true psychological transformation happens when the individual integrates parts of himself that were previously hidden in the shadows. This process is rarely comfortable. In fact, it almost always begins with a phase of deep loneliness. But when this crossing ends, something extraordinary appears, a quieter, more lucid form of consciousness, and impossible to manipulate. It is at this point that many lonely people realize something surprising. They are no longer looking for their place in the world. They simply became who they really are, and from that moment on, nothing is ever the same again. There are very clear signs that this transformation has taken place. Signs that do not appear in words, but in the way the person lives, observes, and moves through the world. And if you recognize some of these signs in yourself, you may be closer to the Sophia phase than you realize. The quiet moment when the lonely person realizes he never belonged to the same world. There is a very strange moment in the lives of some loners. It doesn't happen dramatically. There is no such thing as a major event. There is no sudden revelation. In fact, it seems just an ordinary day. But something changes within the person so deeply that after that moment, they can never look at the world in the same way again. For many years, the lone empath tries to do something that feels natural to everyone around him. He tries to adapt. He watches people. He learns how they speak. He learns how they react. He tries to understand what others expect of him. And for a long time, he believes that the problem is in him. Maybe he's too sensitive. Maybe overthink. Perhaps you feel things that no one else feels. Then he tries to adjust parts of himself. He tries to be lighter. He tries to be simpler. He tries to be more like others. But there is a detail that almost no one notices in this process. The more the empath tries to adapt to the world around him, the farther away he begins to feel about himself. Carl Jung described something very similar when he talked about the process of individuation. According to Jung, there comes a point in some people's lives when the soul begins to demand authenticity. It is no longer possible to continue living just to fit in. It is no longer possible to continue ignoring what one feels deeply. And when that moment arrives, something silent begins to happen. The lonely begins to perceive something that previously seemed impossible to accept. He never fully belonged to the world he was trying to please. For years he believed he was trying to find his place, but now He begins to realize that maybe it was never about finding a place. Maybe it was about becoming something different. This moment can be uncomfortable at first, because it destroys an old hope. The hope that one day everything would make sense simply by fitting better with the world's expectations. But when that hope disappears, something very curious appears in the place. A sense of quiet freedom. The lonely begins to realize that he no longer needs to fight to be understood by everyone. He no longer needs to explain every feeling. He no longer needs to justify his way of seeing the world. And when this perception settles deeply, something inside him relaxes for the first time, not because the world has changed, but because he finally stopped trying to be someone he never was. This is one of the first signs of the Sophia phase. It is not a moment of bitter isolation. It is a moment of clarity. The person begins to realize that their journey has never been about becoming like others. It was about going through experiences that few can go through. It was about developing a deeper perception of life. And when this understanding finally sets in, the loner notices something that changes everything. The loneliness that once seemed like a burden begins to transform into space. Space to think, space to feel, space to exist without masks. Carl Jung believed that true psychological maturity begins when a person stops running away from who they really are. And for many loners, this is exactly the moment when the transformation begins. They're no longer trying to belong, they are starting to become. And from that point on, the path back to the old identity simply ceases to exist. When the need for approval disappears. Quietly, there is a silent habit that accompanies many empaths for much of their lives. The search for approval. This does not always appear in an evident way. It is often not a direct request for recognition. It's something more subtle. It is the desire to know if everything is okay. It is the need to feel that your choices make sense to others. It's that little expectation that someone will say, "You're on the right track." For a long time, this search seems almost natural, because the empath cares deeply about the impact it has on people. He senses when someone is uncomfortable. He notices when something he said has been misinterpreted. He carries within him a sensibility that makes the harmony around him seem extremely important. But there is a point in the psychological journey when something changes almost imperceptibly. The need for approval begins to disappear. Not because the person has decided to ignore others, not because she became cold, but because something inside her has finally found a deeper foundation. Carl Jung said that one of the greatest transformations of individuation happens when the person stops depending on external validation to sustain their identity. While one constantly needs the approval of others, one's identity is still partially in the hands of the world. But when that need starts to fade, something very powerful happens. One becomes inwardly stable, and this stability no longer depends on praise, acceptance, or recognition. At first, this change may seem strange even to the empath itself. He realizes that he no longer feels that urgency to explain his decisions. He realizes that he no longer needs to convince anyone about who he is. He begins to live more quietly, simpler, more true. And something very curious happens when this transformation deepens. People around begin to realize that there is something different. Not necessarily something visible, but something in that person's presence has changed. She no longer constantly tries to please. She no longer tries to keep everyone comfortable all the time. It simply exists with a tranquility that once seemed impossible. This is a very clear characteristic of the Sophia phase. The lonely person stops seeking approval because he has finally found something much rarer, authenticity. And when someone reaches that point, its presence changes completely, because now their decisions no longer come from the fear of rejection. They come from a much deeper place, a place where the person finally learned to trust their own conscience. Carl Jung believed that this inner confidence is one of the clearest signs that the individual has begun to integrate deep parts of himself. It is not arrogance, it is not indifference, it is simply the peace of someone who no longer needs to ask permission to exist. And when that peace appears, something curious happens. The empath realizes that what he has been looking for years in the eyes of others, it was always waiting inside him. And when this discovery happens, the journey enters a new phase, a phase in which the lonely is no longer trying to be accepted. He simply went on to live up to who he became, and for those who go through this transformation, returning to the old way of living no longer seems possible. The integration of the shadow, the day the lonely stop fighting himself. For a long time, the empath believes that it needs to be just light. He believes he needs to be understanding. He believes he needs to be patient. He believes that he always needs to choose the gentler, more balanced, more correct path. And for many years, he tries to live that way. But there is something that few notice in this process. When someone tries to be just light, important parts of one's soul end up being pushed into darkness. Carl Jung called these forgotten parts the shadow. The shadow is not evil. The shadow is not destruction. The shadow is simply everything that the person has learned to hide in order to be accepted. Anger, instinct, limits, strength, desires that seem too dangerous to show. For much of his life, the empath tries to keep these parts hidden. He believes that if he lets them appear, he may lose what he has always valued, the ability to feel, understand, and care. But there is a point in the journey when something changes. The loner begins to realize that denying his own shadow has not made him more complete. In fact, it left him more divided. He realizes that part of his exhaustion came precisely from this constant struggle to always appear balanced, always kind, always available. And then an extremely important moment happens, a moment that Carl Jung considered essential in the process of individuation, the moment when the person stops running away from parts of themselves. She begins to look inward more honestly. She begins to recognize feelings that she previously avoided admitting. She realizes that there is strength where before she saw only danger. She realizes that there is truth where before she saw only imperfection. This moment can be uncomfortable, because integrating the shadow means accepting that we are more complex than we would like to believe. But at the same time, something very powerful happens. When the lonely accepts these hidden parts, he ceases to fight against himself. The energy that was once used to hide, control, and deny. Now it begins to turn into clarity. The empath remains sensitive, but now it also becomes firm. He continues to understand others, but now he also understands himself. He learns something that profoundly changes his way of existing. Boundless goodness is not maturity. Understanding without self-awareness is not wisdom. True maturity is born when light and shadow cease to be enemies, and they begin to exist together. This is one of the clearest signs of the Sophia phase. The person no longer needs to pretend to be perfect. She no longer needs to hide her intensity. It simply becomes whole. And when someone becomes whole, something very interesting happens. Life no longer seems like a constant struggle. It starts to look like a journey of consciousness. Carl Jung said that the integration of the shadow is one of the most difficult transformations of human life. But it is also one of the most liberating, because from that moment on, the loner is no longer divided between who he is and who he thinks he should be. He eventually became a single person, and when that happens, a new form of freedom begins to be born. Invisible detachment, When old bonds simply lose their strength, there is something that happens to many lonely people after a profound transformation begins to take place within them. It's not something they plan, it's not something they consciously decide, but little by little certain connections begin to change. People who once seemed extremely important begin to become more distant. Conversations that once seemed meaningful start to feel empty. Environments that once seemed familiar begin to feel strangely uncomfortable. And this can be confusing at first, because the lonely person does not feel anger at these people. He doesn't feel rejection. He simply feels that something has changed inside him. Carl Jung observed something very interesting about the processes of inner transformation. When a person's consciousness changes profoundly, your relationship with the world also changes. Not because the world has become different, but because the way of perceiving the world has changed. The empath who begins to go through the Sophia phase notices something very curious. He can no longer participate in certain emotional dynamics that once seemed normal. Empty discussions start to feel tiresome. Constant competition starts to seem meaningless. The need to prove something to others starts to seem strange. And little by little, the person begins to move away from these dynamics. Not aggressively, not with contempt, but with a quiet tranquility. He simply stops investing energy in things that no longer make sense to his consciousness. This is an extremely important moment of transformation, because many people believe that growing spiritually means connecting more and more with everyone around them. But in reality, the opposite often happens. The person starts to become more selective with their energy. She realizes that not all connections are really deep. Not all conversations are actually true. Not all relationships are truly nourishing for the soul. And that doesn't make her cold. In fact, it often makes it even more sensitive. But now this sensitivity is accompanied by awareness. The solitary learns something very valuable. Not everything needs to be loaded. Not all ties need to be maintained. Not all stories need to continue. This detachment is rarely dramatic. It happens almost invisibly. The person simply stops participating in certain dynamics. She stops explaining herself so much. She stops trying to maintain relationships that exist only out of habit. And little by little, his world begins to reorganize. Some people disappear. Some connections weaken. Some relationships are completely transformed, and instead something simpler begins to appear. Silence, space, clarity. Carl Jung said that psychological growth often requires us to leave behind old parts of our life, not because they were wrong, but because they belong to an earlier version of who we were. And when the lonely realizes this, he understands something profoundly liberating. Transformation does not require him to destroy the past. She only asks him to stop living attached to him. This is yet another silent sign that the Sophia phase has begun. The world around can remain the same, but the way the loner moves inside him, it changed forever. The strange calm that arises after the death of the old identity. There is a very specific moment in the inner journey of some lonely people when something unexpected happens. After years of internal conflicts, silence arises. Not an external silence, but a silence inside one's own mind. For a long time, the empath lived in constant inner movement. He questioned his choices. He reviewed conversations. He wondered if he had hurt anyone. He tried to understand if he was on the right track. This mental activity seemed endless. It was as if his conscience was always trying to find balance between who he was and who the world expected him to be. But when the transformation begins to complete, something curious happens. The old identity begins to fade, not violently, not through a dramatic decision, but like an old skin that simply stops fitting. Carl Jung described this process as a symbolic death. The death of the persona that was built to survive within the expectations of the world. For years, the empath has built versions of himself to adapt. Quieter versions, nicer versions, more comprehensive versions, versions that carried emotions that were not even their own. But there comes a point when the soul can no longer sustain these masks. And when they start to fall, something very interesting happens. The inner conflict disappears. Because the empath is no longer trying to be two people at the same time. He's no longer trying to balance who he really is with whom others expect him to be. This liberation creates something that many loners describe in the same way. A strange calm. A calm that does not depend on external circumstances. A calm that does not depend on approval. A calm that simply exists. Carl Jung believed that this state appears when consciousness finally begins to align with the essence of the person. It is when the individual stops living divided. The lonely person continues to live in the same world. The same people still exist. The same challenges still appear. But now there is something inside him that no longer moves in the same way. He no longer reacts with the same intensity. He no longer tries to control everything around him. He no longer feels the same urgency to explain who he is. Because something very important has finally happened. He stopped fighting his own nature. And when that fight ends, something very rare appears. Peace, not a superficial peace, but a deep peace. The peace of someone who has finally stopped running away from himself. This is one of the clearest signs that the loner has entered the Sophia phase. The old identity no longer needs to exist because something much truer has taken its place. And when that happens, life begins to be lived in a completely new way. The new form of love. When the lonely learn to indwell his soul for a long time, the empath believed that to love meant to give everything. He believed that to love meant to understand without limits. He believed that to love meant to be always available. For years, this was his natural way of relating to the world. He offered presence, he offered listening, it offered emotional energy. But there is something that many empaths only realize very late in the journey. They learn to love others before learning to inhabit themselves. This did not happen out of weakness. This happened because their sensitivity naturally led them to perceive the needs around them. They saw pain where no one else did. They perceived emotions that went unnoticed by almost everyone, and it made them feel a quiet responsibility. But when the inner journey begins to deepen, something very important changes. The empath begins to turn his attention inward. He begins to notice something that has always been there. He also needed care. He also needed space. He also needed understanding. This moment is not born of the ego. It is born of consciousness. The loner begins to realize that his sensitivity was never a mistake. It was just being used in an unbalanced way. And when this understanding appears, something begins to reorganize itself within him. For the first time, he begins to direct to himself the same care that he has offered to the world for so many years. He begins to respect his own boundaries. He begins to listen to his own needs. He begins to protect his own emotional energy. This process creates something very powerful, a new form of love, a love that is not born from the need to be accepted, a love that is not born from the fear of losing connections, but a love that is born of presence. Carl Jung believed that true emotional maturity happens when a person begins to relate to himself with the same honesty that he seeks in others. When the lonely learns this, something changes profoundly. He no longer feels empty when he is alone. He no longer feels the urgency to fill every space with company, because now there's something much more solid inside of it. Inner presence. He begins to discover that loneliness is not the absence of love. In fact, it is often the space where the truest love begins to be born. This is one of the most transformative signs of the Sophia phase. The lonely person is no longer looking for someone to complete who he is. He finally learned to inhabit his own soul. And when someone learns that, their relations with the whole world begin to change. Because now he doesn't approach people to fill a void. He approaches from a fullness, and it completely transforms the way he loves, lives, and moves through the world. The silent ascension. Why few recognize those who have reached the Sophia stage. There is something curious about people who have actually gone through a profound transformation. Almost no one notices immediately. They do not announce what they have experienced. They don't try to convince anyone that they've changed. They don't constantly talk about awakening, evolution, or growth. In fact, they often seem even quieter than before. But there is something different from them, something that does not appear in words, but in the way they exist. For many years, the empath lived trying to find his place. He tried to adapt. He tried to be understood. He tried to maintain connections. He tried to explain feelings that often had no words. But after going through the inner journey that few have the courage to go through, something changes profoundly. He stops looking for a place in the world because he understands something very simple. His place has never been out. It has always been inside. This realization creates a very big change in the way the lonely moves through life. He no longer feels the need to prove anything. He no longer feels the urgency to convince others of who he is. He no longer needs to show his depth, because now his presence speaks for itself. Carl Jung said that true individuation does not transform someone into a noisier person. It transforms someone into a more whole person. And when someone becomes whole, your energy changes. There is a different tranquility. There is an emotional stability that does not depend so much on the surrounding environment. There is a clarity that once seemed impossible to achieve. The solitary continues to be sensitive. He continues to perceive emotional nuances. He continues to see things that go unnoticed by many, but now that sensitivity is no longer a burden, she became consciousness. He no longer feels overwhelmed by the intensity of life. He simply observes, more calmly, with more lucidity, with more presence. And that creates something very interesting. People around begin to feel that there is something different. They may not understand exactly what has changed, but they realize that that person no longer reacts as before. She no longer gets lost easily in emotional conflicts. She no longer seems so affected by small turbulences. There is a kind of quiet stability in his presence. This is one of the clearest signs of the Sophia phase. It is not a stage of superiority. It is not a spiritual level displayed to others. It is simply the natural consequence of someone who has gone through their own darkness and come out of it with more awareness. True transformation is rarely visible. It happens in the deepest layers of the soul, and for this very reason it often goes unnoticed. But those who have already reached this stage know something very important. The journey was never about becoming special. It was never about proving something to the world. It was about something much simpler, become true. And when someone finally reaches that point, something inside him stabilizes forever. He no longer needs to chase meaning. He no longer has to look for answers everywhere. Because now there's a very clear feeling inside of it. He went through the journey. He found himself. And when that happens, life goes on. But it will never be lived in the same way again. Because the loner who has reached the Sophia phase is no longer trying to figure out who he is. He finally became what he was always meant to be.